This week we're starting a new chapter, chapter 9, talking about market power and monopolies. Last week we talked a little bit about the perfect competition case, where um, you have a lot of different firms competing without setting prices. They all have very similar products. Because they have similar products, and because there are a lot of firms, they didn't get to choose how much they were charging. Now we're going to look at the opposite case where we have one very strong firm. This firm gets to uh, behave in a way that is a lot different than the firms that we saw in perfect competition. In the real world, there are very few cases where we have perfect competition. Last week, I talked about farms. Farmers have oftentimes little ability to set prices, but when we talk about most industries, we're talking about non-perfect competition cases. Firms often have market power or an ability to influence the market price of a product. We're going to first look at the most extreme example, which is a monopoly, or a market that's only served by one firm. A monopolist is the sole supplier and price setter of a good in the market. Uh, the key difference between a uh, perfect competition market structure and uh, any market structure where firms have price setting ability is the presence of barriers to entry, or factors that prevent entry into the market with large producer surplus. We're for 9.1 here, we're going to quickly go through 5 different sources of market power. The first is extreme scale economies. Uh, the classic example is a natural monopoly, where one common barrier to entry results from a production process that exhibits economies of scale at every quantity level. That just means that it's more efficient for a single firm to produce the entire industry output. Splitting output across a lot of different firms raises the average cost of production. If we have a total cost structure like this TC equals 100 plus 10Q. If we were to find the average total cost, remember that's just dividing the total cost dividing the total cost by Q. We would have an average total cost of 100 divided by Q plus 10. And so increasing the quantity produced decreases the average total cost. This is what we would expect to see in a natural monopoly. What kind of industries might exhibit this sort of continuously declining average total cost structure? You would expect things like utilities, electric, water, telecommunications. When you think about uh, telephone lines, it would become very expensive for a lot of firms to install their own telephone lines. So a lot of times what cities will do is give a firm a monopoly because a natural monopoly because it becomes very expensive um, to for a lot of firms to produce it, but it's relatively cheap for one firm to create more and more lines. Their average total cost decreases the more that they produce. A second source of market power is switching costs. There are a lot of examples of switching costs. You might have preferences or preferred status between brands. So I have frequent flyer miles with, say, Delta. That would increase the cost of me booking a flight on American Airlines. Because I have this built up stock of benefits with Delta, I'm more likely to stay with Delta. And because I'm more likely to stay with Delta, uh, Delta gets market power. There are also technology constraints. Software isn't compatible across every single operating system. I'm using a Mac right now. I use some Mac apps, and the next computer that I'll probably buy is a Mac because of this sort of path dependency. There are also search costs. If you have a market like health insurance, where me as an individual customer, I don't have a lot of information about the types of costs that I will incur in the future in the health insurance marketplace. And so for me to figure out what the best option is very difficult. And because it's difficult, uh, that gives the firms market power. Some goods are also network goods. That's just a good whose value to each customer increases with the number of consumers of the product. The classic example of this, maybe it's not classic, it's relatively new, social networks. I'm more likely to use Instagram, or you're more likely to use Facebook or TikTok or whatever, because other people are using it. The product's value to you increases the more people who are using it. Telecommunications is similar. There's also product differentiation. For most non-commodity markets, so it just means for non-agricultural output, for non-mining input, for most goods that you and I consume every day, we don't treat the products from different firms as perfect substitutes. I wouldn't say that Burger King and Chipotle are perfect substitutes, despite the fact that they're both competing for fast food company customers. The products themselves are highly differentiated. If I'm in the market for Tex-Mex, I'm not going to go to Burger King. In general, product differentiation just refers to imperfect substitutability across varieties of a product. The fourth one is absolute cost advantages or controls of key inputs. A lot of production processes rely on scarce inputs, for example, natural resources. Uh, in the oil market, Saudi Aramco, which is Saudi Arabia's state-run oil company, has exclusive rights to a huge amount of oil in the ground because it's in Saudi Arabian territory. Because of that, they have relatively low extraction costs because they're not paying anyone for access to the oil in the ground. In other circumstances, firms may develop absolute cost advantages by engaging in long term contracts. Apple does this with manufacturers in China. Um, they say, we will produce all of our iPhones and iPads and Macs for the next 10 years if you give us a good deal on the cost of production. Southwest Airlines similarly does these 3 to 5 year long-term contracts with jet fuel providers. They lock in a price for a long time, and for the jet fuel providers, that gives them a steady source of revenue. And then the last one, last source of market power, is government regulation. Government regulation can limit entry into a market. Uh, Patents provide a sort of guarantee of uh, intellectual property for new firms that prevents other firms from using the patent. Licensing requirements are similar. A lot of occupations, from barbers to medicine professions, have certifications that they must pass first. And because you have these certifications, it limits the ability of new suppliers to enter into the market. And sometimes the government just prohibits competition. The Postal Service, the Post Office, is a prominent example of this, where the government guarantees that everybody gets access to mail delivery, but you don't see UPS or FedEx delivering mail. That is the exclusive realm of the post office. So those are the 5 sources of market power: economy, extreme scale economies, switching costs, product differentiation, absolute cost advantages, and government regulation.